Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Hatley. I'm CEO of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here today. This is the fourth in our series of webinars in a series on making space for the social sciences that has been convened by my colleague, Professor Roy McLeod and Claire McFarland. In a moment, I'll introduce Roy to introduce our speakers and provide some context to the series. But before I do that, I want to play a short acknowledgement of country video that we use for online events. So give me a second, I'll share my screen.
Wherever you are across Australia,
we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land.
The Darug peoples.
The Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
The Gundungurra people of the Southern Highlands.
The Ngunnawal people of the Canberra region on whose country we are standing.
And all other peoples of this vast continent.
Their ongoing connection through custodianship of its land and waters.
Physical and spiritual.
Through culture, language and ceremony.
Where sovereignty was never ceded. We pay our respects to elders past, present and still to come.
So, it's now my pleasure to introduce Roy McLeod. Professor Roy McLeod is a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences, a Fellow of the Academy of the Humanities, and he is the convener of this series. He's going to give some context and then introduce our moderator and panelists. Thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. Good morning and greetings from the traditional lands of the Camaragal people to our next session in the series Australia's Future in Space, an Emerging Agenda for the Social Sciences. As Chris has mentioned, my name is Roy McLeod. I'm a historian of science and an emeritus professor of history at Sydney University. And as one born in the Kennedy generation, who has lived with space for most of his life, I want to share with you my interest and passion in this adventure and concern for its future. Some may say, of course, that to launch such a series as this in the midst of the worst pandemic in a century is for many reasons not the best idea. Certainly in no way must we let our attention be distracted from the urgencies of the day. But just for a moment, I'd like to ask you to sit with me and let slip the surly bonds of earth and to consider what might be awaiting us and may well be upon us even before the end of the present decade. For many, the idea that we'll be active in space is already a given. During the last 2 years, few will have missed the rapid series of space-related events around the world. As you know, in 2019, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing. And through 2020 and already through 2021, we've seen a number of important developments. This year, there have been no fewer than 11 significant space missions. February brought us the extraordinary views of Mars when the UAE's Hope successfully orbited the red planet and NASA's Perseverance and China's Tianwen-1 touched down safely. And we've seen SpaceX and news of NASA's commercial payload services. And then we have, looking forward, I think, quite soon now, the launch of the James Webb Space Telescope, one of the most ambitious scientific missions in recent years. And in November, NASA is launching Orion, and our Artemis mission that will test whether we as humans can safely get to the moon and back on a regular basis. Well, all these are, of course, the work of science and technology on a grand scale. But we've also seen the arrival of new forms of human endeavor, not least in the shape of space tourism, led by Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson, and soon I'm sure to be followed by Elon Musk. Space has become a very human enterprise, replete with human stories of competition and controversy. And many see in this as I do, a danger of principles and possibilities being rushed and compromised by commercialization and competition, raising questions about the ethics and behavior that should frame our presence in space. Of course, we know that the hard work of space diplomacy proceeds apace. Nations have long debated the need to strengthen the promise and provisions of the 1967 Space Treaty, and so far 12 countries have become signatories to the Artemis Accords. This is all helpful, I think, in working in the right direction. But it also prompts us, I think, to think more closely about the social and human aspects of space exploration and the possibility of settlement. Indeed, how are we to conduct ourselves and behave towards the new environments that we encounter? How will our interaction with space, driven by the few, ultimately benefit the many? Such questions force us to reflect upon the role that the social sciences ought to play, hand in hand with the natural sciences and technologies that have so far dominated the scene. Well, in this act of reflection, I believe it's also time to fashion a focus on Australia and on Australia's present and potential participation in the space enterprise. As historians like Kerry Doherty and others have recorded, Australia actually has a long history of engagement with space. And now, since 2018, we have our own space agency, which we hope will open new frontiers. We have excellent media coverage in several centers devoted to space law and strategy and defense. But as social scientists and humanists, I think we must ask even more fundamental questions, not only about the how, but also about the whether and the why, and in what ways, and to what ends, and with what consequences. We must question in whose interest do we, as Australians, venture first to the moon and then to Mars and beyond. Well, it's to some of these questions that the series is devoted. 9 moderators and their teams have accepted our invitation to draw upon their respective disciplines and discourses of culture, history, health, heritage, law, diplomacy, and industry, all dealing with the practicalities of being and living in space. To conclude the series, at the end of the day, we've asked 2 generations of young Australians, recent graduates and some still in school, to join us and to reflect upon the prospect of their own spacefaring futures. We hope you'll enjoy the sessions in the series and participate in our conversations through the chat facilities. All sessions, as Chris has earlier indicated, will be recorded and made available for later viewing. Warm acknowledgements go to all members of our teams and to the many who have helped us in these rather difficult times. At the moment, let me start by thanking Chris Hatherley and the Academy in Canberra, and my colleagues in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Sydney. Our guides, Jose Turalba and Jacob Craig, who are in the shadows, in the virtual shadows, and most especially my colleague, Ms. Claire McFarlane, for getting us all safely underway. Let me now, I have the pleasure of introducing the moderator of this morning's session, Donna Lawler, who will introduce in turn her speakers and participants and set us off. Over to you, Donna.
Thank you so much, Roy. It's a pleasure to be joining you from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation here in Sydney in deepest, darkest lockdown. Thank you for inviting us to the Academy and to the University of Sydney. I am a lawyer, so some might say I'm a social scientist myself, if you've got a very broad definition. I am a principal of Azimuth Advisory, which is a law firm specialising in space activities. So I've been working in the space industry for over 20 years, but we've just had our own space law firm for the last couple of years, together with my husband, Professor Stephen Freeland. We are going to have a bit of a whirlwind tour here and a discussion with 3 luminous space insiders who are going to bring their insights. These are 3 fantastic people that I've been wanting to get together all in one room. It'd be better if we could have them all together for a while. And I'm hoping I'm going to be joining with them for a glass of wine sometime in the near future. But in the meantime, let's just enjoy their virtual presence. Frank, Alison, and Tim have so much to say. I'll limit my remarks just to one point. We're going to be talking today about building the space infrastructure. What is the future, and how are we going to build the space infrastructure in Australia? Will we do it? Can we do it? Should we do it? And what is the contribution that social scientists are going to have in this burgeoning area? I was a massive skeptic when the space agency first came into being in 2018. I thought, how on earth is creating a new government entity going to actually make any difference? It's really all about private enterprise. That was my heart of hearts belief. And you know what? I can admit now I was wrong. So if you can imagine a pan full of popcorn kernels, back then there were a whole lot of popcorn kernels sitting on this pan. And it seems to me, I don't know whether it was the space agency or whether it was something else or whether it was just time, but all of those little popcorn kernels, which are space companies, have just popped up everywhere. So that is why we created our law firm, because it was needed. Legal advice was needed in this area. And that is why we do have a burgeoning industry. But to talk about it, we have some extraordinary people. We're going to start with Frank Robert, who is an Associated Vice President of Carney. He's also, there's a very good reason why he was selected to be a member of the Australian Space Agency Advisory Board. Another time, if you catch him over a glass of wine, you'll have to ask him about why he almost became a lawyer, but instead ended up walking down the hallway and becoming a student of Carl Sagan, and is now, has since then been involved in interplanetary missions. He is a consultant to anyone who's anyone in globally in the space industry, and his opinion is highly valued. So you can read more about his bio. I won't read it all out, but trust me, it's long. I'll leave it to you, Frank. If you want to share your slides, you might as well do that now. It looks like you're joining us from Titan. Is that right, Frank?
Well, thank you very much. My head is not going to fit through the door after that introduction from our wonderful Donna. I've had the pleasure of collaborating with her and her husband Stephen on the advisory board of the space agency. I hasten to point to the little call out at the bottom left that I'm speaking as me. I'm not speaking as a representative of the space agency or officially of Carney, but particularly not of the space agency. But it's a great pleasure to connect the infrastructure for space of Australia to the social sciences with you all today. It's a very unusual undertaking and I think worthwhile. Just in the top level, I'm sure you're all aware of it already, but that before COVID hit, the industry worldwide was at least $350 billion US, and it depends on how you count the various segments of it, expected to rise to over $1 trillion by 2040. And the Space Agency of Australia has dedicated itself to partially commercial objectives. You wouldn't call it an Australia of space, but it's trying to open doors for Australian businesses in space internationally and grow the domestic business to 12 billion in 2030. And the mechanisms for doing this are germane to what we're talking about today. The chart that is showing here, if this is visible to you all, is the return on some very successful space agencies commercially. And these numbers, 4.75 means 475% return to Norway on its agency. And I hasten to say, A, the data is old, but B, it's very hard to measure this. So they're probably understated by quite a significant margin. And by example, when people argue that the investment in Apollo, which was several percent of U.S. GDP, between 3 and 6, based on various estimates, that more crops were saved than the value of the whole Apollo program by the infrared photography of crops worldwide that was spawned by that. So it can be a significantly profitable undertaking. This slide focuses on my favorite quote of my fellow advisory board member, Lisa Harvie Smith, who is a professor at University of New South Wales and the government Women in STEM ambassador. She calls space the gateway drug to STEM education, and I think particularly for women. The headline below shows the usually fairly critical and caustic Washington Post describing the Cassini mission to Saturn. And you see images of Saturn from behind the planet with this about to be sunrise. Enceladus with the plumes that may bespeak, well, we believe they bespeak a global ocean and the possibility of life. The Cassini orbiter and the landing on Titan of the Huygens lander, and the little device behind me is pictured on the next page in the upper left as well. These are upcoming missions. So Cassini was one of the most successful of the prior missions, and missions in which Australia could participate include quite a number that are very highly qualified and have not received full funding, like the one to the right in the top here, which is a lander that the German Space Agency, the DLR, and the European Space Agency are teaming on to use the waste heat of a nuclear generator to melt through the ice on Europa and disgorge a little artificially intelligent submarine under the ice to look autonomously, since it's I think some light half hour from Earth, usually, to look for plumes of hot water and volcanic vents that may bespeak colonies of life as they do on Earth. And in the upper left is the nuclear drone, the Dragonfly rover, which is funded by NASA, on track for launch to Titan, moon of Saturn. And then in the bottom, you've got 2 Australian missions that are collaboratives of Australian space companies, the Lunar Ascent Rideshare mission and the Seven Sisters Australian lunar mission, showing its mapping of the lunar surface. So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on that Australia can participate in. The space agency sees a number of areas of potential opportunity. The world in which GPS is a part is position navigation and timing, since GPS operates by nuclear clocks. It's just a very precise clock, so that the receivers on the ground can tell how long the signal took to arrive from each spacecraft. And satellite-based augmentation can bring that down to centimeter level of precision. And hundreds of millions have been invested in that in Australia for the Australian mainland and surrounding waters. Earth observation is adding the full spectrum at each pixel, spectrographic and synthetic aperture radar observations, which can allow monitoring of bushfires, watershed catchments, and so forth. And I won't go into the detail of each of them, but these are the main areas that the space agency feels in which Australia can excel. And some of them, like robotics and automation, are taking technologies that are active on underwater and in mines and porting them to use in space. In communication technologies and services, Australia has potential to be a lead in the world in quantum encrypted communications, optical distribution of quantum keys, the use of adaptive optics, which is the way that a telescope mirror morphs itself to compensate for the wiggling of the atmosphere, so detwinkling stars also has the effect of improving the accuracy of communications links and Earth observation. What are we doing about it? The Infrastructure Fund on the left has set up an Australian mission control facility and a ground-based robotics control system. There is an international investment initiative which is helping Australian companies join multinational initiatives. The Artemis Moon to Mars program, under which Australian companies are funded to contribute to the supply chains and to provide hopefully world-leading technologies into NASA's Moon to Mars mission. And not shown here is the Modern Manufacturing Initiative, which is over $1 billion that is going into, part of it is going into space. That was the first one off the ranks of the Modern Manufacturing Initiatives of Australia. The next slide shows the communications roadmap. There's a roadmap for each of those areas on the prior slide. And we feel that the low Earth orbit satellites, for those not fully initiated in this, the geosynchronous orbit, first identified by Arthur C. Clarke, has been used for most of the life of spacefaring. And now the low Earth orbit satellites of Elon Musk and others are offering very short travel times to the spacecraft, and with constellations offering terabit speed services to single points on the ground by focusing multiple spacecraft. Optical ground stations we talked about, and quantum and the management of satellite communications networks. Just to sum up, the agency is on track for doing what it says it will do. Its programs seem to be successful so far, and its mechanisms relevant to this talk are looking at the resources of the space industry to start with, and selectively funding growth and augmentation, filling the gaps to end-to-end mission capability that has a sovereign element to it. And this filling the gaps is the mechanism that they're using, particularly focused on areas where Australia can lead. And the final photograph here is of the interstellar mission, which is headed directly to interstellar space on the edge of the solar system, that is in consideration currently in the Cattle Survey. So I hope I haven't overrun my time, and Donna, back to you.
That was spectacularly timely. Thank you, Frank. And who would have known that stars needed to be de-twinkled? It makes me feel a little sad to think that there's someone out there de-twinkling stars. But I hope that is giving people a really fantastic overview about what the kinds of things that are happening, how the space agency is going about making that happen. We're going to turn now to Dr. Tim Parsons, who is another deep tech guy. You're both, in fact, all three of our panelists are deep tech people. Tim is going to talk about what it's going to take for us to get there, and to give you a kind of brief overview. He has so many hats, Tim, but he has been the person that has been hovering around and in the middle of the space industry in Australia for many years now, knitting people together, facilitating, investing, mentoring, consulting. He is the chair of the Space Industry Association of Australia. He's coordinating the New South Wales node of the SmartSat CRC, and he's representing Euroconsult in Australia. There's so much more to be said, but I'm going to let Tim speak for himself. And tell us, Tim, how are we going to do this? Frank's given us a great introduction, but apart from twinkling stars as well, what else are we going to do to build a space industry in Australia?
Well, Donna, I was hoping you and your audience would have some of those answers actually today. Thank you for that great introduction. I would, and thank you, Frank, for the fantastic context setting and background and foreground you know, we're in Australia, we have an unbelievable access and privilege to the heart of the US space program. You know, almost unlike any other nation, we have been able to participate in some of these projects. For example, the very latest Mars mission has a groundbreaking Earth life detection payload from QUT on it. We have Australians in Jet Propulsion Laboratory who've been instrumental in designing and delivering that latest Mars mission and have done for many years. So Australia has this incredible access to the biggest space programs and the biggest sort of parts of the infrastructure puzzle. And we're also entering the industry at a very interesting time. The big change that is probably most of you is within reach of our, you know, over the last 10 years, this mobile phone, which I'm holding in my hand, and it's being slightly disappeared by the video. In fact, that is basically a satellite. It has a battery, it has a camera, it has a GPS inside, it has an antenna, has a computer, it communicates remotely. In fact, it's got more than a satellite because it's got a nice touch screen and stereo speakers. And what we found is that this technology has reduced the cost of sending spacecraft into orbit and getting them to do useful things by as much as 100x. And in some cases, people have managed to get useful spacecraft into space for 1,000 times less than we might have expected for the Apollo era. So that's opened up this pathway to say, okay, well, maybe a country that doesn't want to spend, you know, tens of billions of dollars on space, but actually could start to engage in building some presence in participating in the global supply chains that Frank described, that 2040 number of $1.4 trillion. And then as we've leaned into this sector, we've actually learned, wow, this is a sector which is going through a dramatic transformation. This cost of space assets has accelerated the rate at which we can run experiments, at which we can run commercial experiments, not just scientific experiments. We can take technologies and actually use them for social type experiments, such as looking at the Myanmar refugee situation that was caused by the Rohingya people, right? That's people are talking about using spacecraft to count the cars in Walmart to assess what their next quarterly results might be from a financial point of view. We're now also looking at what the humanitarian impacts around the world might be, because we can see them from space. So we're at this stage now in Australia's building of infrastructure, space infrastructure, which I describe as the messy middle. And we've got to learn a whole lot of new skills. What we're also discovering is the more established space ecosystems around the world, in Europe and in the US, they are going through the same transformation. They're going through this same transformation from very big, centralized, quite bureaucratic space programs, you might argue, plus some really fun, super insightful, thoughtful space exploration programs. They're now being reset into harnessing entrepreneurialism, harnessing a more rapid, fail fast, learn, go again approach to engineering. And they're also leveraging and starting to leverage the same digital culture that is powering the creation of whole new industries, right, on Earth. Now in Australia, a recent report came out to show that we've been creating a Centaur, $100 million tech startup. Over the last few years, we've been creating one of those every month. Essentially, we've been starting to create unicorn tech companies and $100 million plus tech companies at a much faster rate than ever before. It's an incredibly dynamic part of our economy. And that digital tech ecosystem is now colliding fully with the space ecosystem at a cultural level, at a people-to-people level. And that's where the really interesting, to my mind, social dynamic is we can talk a lot about the technology of space. We could talk a lot about rockets, satellites, hyperspectral cameras, quantum key distribution from orbit, even things like giving the moon and Mars IP addresses so that we can actually send packets to them through the internet, and that's coming. So there's lots of exciting STEM and STEAM technologies and creativity, but there's also this sort of actually a very interesting social challenge, which is how do we work in a different way? How do we take on the risks of this grand endeavor of moving humanity out further into space? And how do we also then reflect back on the Earth that we see? So I think that's fundamentally about this interplay between, yes, space, it's aspirational, it's about high technology, it's about, in the past, it's been about the elite astronauts. And actually what we're starting to see is the democratization of space. We're wanting to see it become more accessible. We're wanting to see it become more open. And we think Australia could actually play this very profound role in the world of being a conduit for that. We're one of the world's leading media countries. It turns out that 1/6 of the world's media is, for good or for ill, directly connected to Australia. We have some of the world's most advanced advertising, media, marketing, storytelling, even computer games companies. And so our ability to take all of the great stories and all of the great, I suppose, inspiration from space, and also the deep engineering of space, we can access all those areas as Australians. And we also need social sciences. We need to understand how to better collaborate together. We need to understand how to better explain what we're doing. And we also need to invite people to come along on the journey. I want to share just a couple of slides in conclusion, just as a thought. I want to take you out into outer space. I want to take you deep into the right at the edge of the solar system, and I want to show you the view from the very edge of that solar system, where we just see stars. Now what we're doing here is we're looking back towards the Earth. We're looking back and in fact, we can't see the sun, we can't see the planets, we can't see the Earth, we can't see anything. If we move a lot closer in a jump, we get to see a planet that has had a massive impact on the Earth by shepherding asteroids and rocks and other debris away from the young Earth to allow life to emerge. But we still can't actually see the Earth in this picture. And the sun, which is behind us, the sun is illuminating this planet, but it's, as Frank mentioned, it's as much as half a light hour. It takes at least half an hour, if not 45 minutes, for light to travel to this place from where we are. If we sneak underneath the rings, we might just be able to catch a view of everybody that we love, everybody that we know, every animal on this planet, every place that we might be enjoying or might have, in fact, everybody that has ever lived. This photograph is arguably one of the most valuable things that occurred in Apollo in a number of extraordinary moments. And this photograph, Apollo 8, was taken by an astronaut that was actually had to pass behind the dark side of the moon to go into orbit. The 3 astronauts on that Apollo 8 mission, people weren't sure if they were going to make it back. And over the next few years in the return to the moon, we're going to have a few more episodes like this where we see astronauts journeying away from the Earth, away from low Earth orbit, out into deep space, out to the moon. And they're going to look back at this incredible jewel. And that is, I think, the biggest gift that space has given us. When we talk about spending money on space, we don't load rockets up with $100 notes. We actually find that the very first thing people want to do when they get up into space is they want to look back at home. And this is our home. And this is a view from a view that people have only just been able to access on their computers in the last decade. And in fact, it may surprise many people that Google Maps on the web was invented in Sydney, here in Australia. And in fact, Google bought the company that invented that technology. So that was an Australian invention. So we've already played a role in democratizing space. This is a very powerful video of another aspect of space. This is video from orbit, or rather instruments from orbit, recording the smoke from the fires at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And this is showing us that not only do we get beautiful photographs of our Earth, but we also get extraordinary insight into our impact on the Earth. As Australia, we have search and rescue responsibility for about 1/6 of the Earth's surface. And we have a very large continent. We're in a position to influence how our impacts on the Earth are going to play out over the next decades. So I think my sort of closing statement is, I want to invite you as social scientists to help us to leverage all these incredible superpowers that we get from space, this perspective on our Earth, and also help us work together, help us collaborate better together, help us teach our children and teach other members of society, and perhaps especially our politicians, and help us really play a leadership role in this endeavor, because we believe we can, and we believe that we should be ambitious, and also we should be ambitious in the ways that we're learning how to do that, as you mentioned before, Roy, ethically, sustainably, powerfully. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was so amazing. So we've gone from Carl Sagan's student to the blue dot, and we're actually, I know I threw you in a little bit unannounced earlier than you thought you were going to be thrown in, Tim. So good on you for just jumping in there. But it's actually worked out very serendipitously, because you have brought us right into thinking about what happens when we go to space and we look back at our Earth. And now we're going to be talking to an extraordinary expert in that area, because Alison Keighley, who is a professor of geodesy at the School of Science at RMIT University, is an expert in that area and in sensors and in finding insights from our observations from space. And so that is no doubt one of the reasons why they selected her, the SmartSat CRC selected her to be the coordinator for research capability. But she's not only good at looking at Earth from afar, she's good at understanding what it is that makes collaboration work, and what it takes to find deep insights and to make deep progress. And so I'm looking forward to hearing more about what Alison has to say, and then we'll move to some questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Donna. I do like it when a group of speakers come together and we almost look like we've coordinated and synchronized our activities, because it kind of makes Australia look like we've organized ourselves to look at what's happening in space. I'd like to also kind of recognize the Academy in putting together this event, because I think it's, for those of us who work in a tech domain, it's often really difficult for us to connect outside the tech domain with the social sciences to create the collaborations that are really essential in understanding what the impact of broad technology developments. When we see a $1 trillion industry based on technology coming into play, we know, we've seen GPS do this in transforming critical sectors of society, and even our lives as we know it, with things like Google Maps and smartphones. And so connecting this into the way society has changed in time is really important. So I'm talking today about a little bit about the Cooperative Research Centre, the SmartSat CRC, and certainly the Space Agency, and the activation of the Space Agency has been a key conduit for setting up the SmartSat CRC. It's a collaboration of 100+ organizations, of which a great number of these are space SMEs in Australia. It's academia, it's government, it's industry coming together with a large investment of funding for R&D. And this will enable Australia to take on a role on the global scale or the global landscape for showcasing where our innovation that you're hearing about today plays a role in some of these international space programs. And it really presents a forum in which we can create impact for Australia's society. And to do that, we've taken a strong technology focus. We've divided up our technologies. We're looking at 3 areas. We're looking at aligned impressively with what the Space Agency is doing as well. So thanks, Frank, for that. We've got 3 broad themes, which is in the area of advanced communication and Internet of Things. So these are all the things around quantum communication, optical communications between satellites in space, between satellites and ground stations. Another one is advanced satellite systems, sensors, and intelligence. This is how do we get satellites themselves to do some of that data processing with all the measurements they're taking? How do we get satellites to avoid colliding into space debris that we know is increasing out there into space? How do we increase the lifespan of satellites in space so we don't have to increase the numbers of satellites going up and creating this space debris as well? And the last one is the next generation Earth observation data service. So strong technology platforms being addressed within the CRC and connecting industry to the innovation that's been kind of locked up in the academic institutions, taking it out and saying, let's open this up and see where it can go. And across all of these technologies, we've embedded the themes of cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, themes that will allow us to protect and automate some of the activities that we want to see happening in space. Now, all of these are great. We love technology, we love using technologies, and we're very good at it. But technology means nothing if we can't create impact. And I think this is where we start looking at where this impact is going to go for the benefit of society. And to do that within the CRC, we've set up these 3 capability demonstrators. All our research is going to be looking at how we pass these technological developments into society through these demonstrators. One of the demonstrators is AquaWatch, as you can see in the slide that I've put up. And AquaWatch is looking at how we better monitor and understand our water quality, inland water quality and coastal water quality. Can we predict and forecast when we were going to have problems? And this is going to help Australia understand this asset, and it's going to put information from Earth observation satellites into the hands of the decision makers. The other one is disaster management. As we've heard before, we want to provide better information and situational awareness, which means we want to combine the information that we're getting from satellites. We want to take that information, we want to combine it with information on the ground, but we also want to combine it with know-how. We have a lot of experts who have worked in disaster management and emergency management for a long time. How do we consolidate all of that information into robust decision-making processes? And then the last one is defense and national security. How do we protect our maritime and littoral boundaries? Using satellites, we're talking about the lowest orbiting satellites at about 800 kilometers, all the way up to the geostationary satellites at about 35,000 kilometers. We want to combine all of the information we get into robust decision-making processes. So I think our interactions with the social sciences community comes under 3 broad areas. How do we create intelligence and knowledge from all of this data? We can't just throw data out there and expect sense making to happen automatically. So what does knowledge and intelligence look like from the data that's being captured from all of these new satellites, all of these new sensors being put into space? How do we create the pathways to adoption? How do we really get this information into the hands of the decision makers in ways that the decision makers can understand, and ultimately into the hands of society, so that society can also, individuals like you and me, can also make our own decisions based on the data that's being provided. And the last one is, how do we create the diverse skills and capabilities to support the space industry of the future? It's not just going to be the engineers and the scientists. Where are these other social experts, the ethicists, the lawyers, the economists? How do they integrate into this broader space community to help us deliver the 2030 vision for space and Australia's role in that? So thank you very much for this opportunity, Donna. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, Alison. And there's so much more we'd like to discuss with you. We have about 10 minutes left, or maybe even a little less. So I'm just going to very quickly go to a couple of questions. Hopefully I'll have time for one brief answer from each of you. I'm not seeing any in the Q&A, but feel free, dear audience, if you have any, to put your questions up there. But in the meantime, I'm just going to sling back to Frank over there on Titan. What is, we're all wanting to build Australian industry capability. Is government procurement a part of that? And if so, what works, what doesn't work? What are some of the challenges? I know we only have a couple of minutes, but what insights can you tell us about that?
Well, to the degree that a consultant can speak briefly, there are efforts to set up ecosystems on the defense side of space that may hold promise for the civil side as well, in that the government is attempting to set up an ecosystem that's organized and that has gaps filled in the same way that we described the space agency doing, although they're doing it on a much bigger scale, like a $300 billion scale. And they're spending $1 billion just to set up the ecosystem. And I believe that that has great promise for synergy between the defense science and technology side and the civil space side. One advantage of Australia is that it is so isolated, so that setting up production lines for holders of US intellectual property can be valuable in now that we've experienced COVID, that having an entirely separate supply line set up is beneficial to them. So it gives us in Australia access to intellectual property that we would not otherwise necessarily have access to. And that gives us we won't act like the Chinese, but it does give us more opportunity to build the local capability so that it becomes end to end.
Our export controls and laws in Australia and overseas are a challenge to building this industry, that they create barriers?
Yes, but there's new legislation in the US that intends to extend its industrial base to countries like Australia in the Five Eyes. So there is a bit of hope, but the international trade, the ITAR regulations have been problematic. Rocket Lab in New Zealand, I think, has been exporting technology from New Zealand to the US, so the US is very happy about it, but coming the other way is...
Yeah, and for those who don't know, ITAR stands for International Traffic in Arms Regulations. So even our civilian satellites and civilian rockets are regarded as trafficking in arms by the United States. And we now have in Australia some quite restrictive export control laws as well, which need to be navigated, but they're applied fairly flexibly. Roy is putting up his hand.
May I just put one question to all of you? I'm intrigued by what you just said, Donna, because it seems to suggest another opening for Australia. Do you know the Australia Group, so-called, which was set up? Yes, everybody knows the Australia Group?
Do tell us more.
Well, the Australia Group was set up about 20 years ago to monitor the export and of precursors of chemicals that could be used in chemical weapons. There's an Australia Group desk, a DFAT, for example, and about 120 other countries around the world. And it's called the Australia Group because it was a group of self-enterprising Australians, well before any treaty negotiations or UN agencies took interest in this. I think there's a certain precedent for Australians independently, as it were, to take the initiative and not wait for the United States, which leads me to my next bigger question, perhaps. No one has mentioned China. And no one has mentioned yet the difficulties that we may face in actually being in space. Getting there is one thing, being there is another, perhaps. And here's where the social sciences have a particular interest. We're conscious of the fact that China says it wants to be there on the moon in 2024, thereabouts, or thereafter. And so what are we going to do when we are on the visible side of the moon together, several different countries? The Antarctic analogy, of course, is commonly drawn upon. And a lot of historians and social scientists are interested in the applications, somewhat flawed analogies and are involved. But the interest there lies in the larger question of how people are to work together once we are in space, how different nationalities, ethnicities, legal jurisdictions, ways of viewing their purpose there, languages as well, of course. Does anyone perhaps have anything to offer on these points?
I might throw that to Alison. What is your experience of collaborations, technical collaborations across lines? It's difficult to collaborate with China because of some of our export controls. That's one of the issues. But
I mean, we have good examples where global collaborations in the area of PNT have been, this issue of interoperability and compatibility across technologies have been realized even with China. I guess what Roy is alluding to is that there are probably more challenges once you kind of are in a common space, trying to operate across a common spatial extent. But I guess it's perhaps something that the space agency also tries to moderate in their interactions. And I guess it is something that has been flagged, is that broader international cooperation on the use and intent for use in space is required. But I guess we do have good examples. It's not something I know too well, but I do know that it is something that I see as being recognized as an issue for broader, more sophisticated international cooperation.
I might also throw in that my co-principal and partner in life, Professor Stephen Freeland, is co-chairing a working group at the UN level to talk about how we deal with the resources on the moon. So every night he's on a Zoom with either Russia or China or the European Space Agency or Germany or the UK or the US. And he's negotiating this every night, trying to, at the beginning, even just understand what the mandate is of their working group. And, little baby steps, but they have actually been successful in getting some agreement at the UN level on some of these small matters. So it can happen. It's slow, but it is often all about listening. I'm not going to say that is going to be a solution to the great schism between China and other parts of the world, but we need to give whatever these little baby steps are a chance at the UN level for discussions to be successful. Thank you for that question, Roy. I might ask just one more quick one, and then I know we're going to have to wrap up. But Tim, do you think we always say that it takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village to build technology and build companies. Can we get the big primes and the small companies working together, and is that going to work for us?
So look, the analogy that I've been testing with some success is that space is like biotech, and in biotech you have this much more integrated pathway for small companies who are doing cutting edge innovation to then have big companies take those innovations and bring them to market. The classic example is the Pfizer vaccine. Pfizer vaccine was created by a startup company in Germany in approximately 2 weeks. And then it took, of course, $1 billion plus in 9 months and massive scale to scale up to production of that vaccine, to go through the testing required to get to FDA approval, et cetera, and then roll those vaccines around the world. So in biotech, you have investors, you have big companies and medium-sized companies that understand it takes a village to get an innovative idea and to run it to the end. And you also have this idea of big challenges, big diseases that people want to tackle. So there's this mission aspect as well. So I think in space, we have an opportunity to now start to drive that similar model where we're sort of not saying to a young company, okay, how soon are you going to get a customer? We're actually saying, who are you going to partner with? And then those big companies, as Frank alluded to, a lot of the way that procurement is being rethought, certainly in the defense sector, and we're hoping in other sectors, is big companies, you need to work with the small companies. You need to bring them in as suppliers. You need to make sure you tap into them. And the next challenge is how we make sure that the most cutting edge technologies actually get adopted, and that old-fashioned technologies that just happen to have a lot of credibility, but they're very expensive, aren't pushed to the fore, which has been a challenge with countries like Australia, where we might actually not be buying what's the latest and greatest piece of technology from a small company, because that small company doesn't have the balance sheet that meets the requirements of that massive contract. So that's the dynamic, right, that we've got to solve for, which is making the energy and the can-do of small and medium companies, but also the systems engineering, project management chops of the big companies. We've got to bring that together somehow, and then actually, deliver systems into space that are highly impactful. So quite a technocratic answer, Donna, but that's the work, and I see that as mostly about people. Yeah.
That's the reality, and there's so much more I'd love to discuss with all of you. I'll hand over to Roy now, because I know we need to wrap up, but maybe we can continue over a glass of wine sometime soon.
Well, thank you, Donna, and thank you all. This has been, for me, most illuminating and encouraging and inspiring. I think we should do this more often. And I think the Academy may be inspired to think about that too. Indeed, I hope the Academy will be thinking about the possibilities of better links with the other academies, the 7 national academies, in such a way as to encourage more cross-fertilization of ideas. At least that's my subtext in some of this. But I want now to, having thanked you all, just to say that those who have participated and those who have not can have access to the recording soon. And I hope that we can disseminate this very much more widely. I want to say that our next session, which is next Tuesday, the 24th, which will be on finding the profitable niche, which to look more specifically at some of the futures for the space industry that others have identified. This will be led by Brad Bittington, and who will look at some of the challenges that he sees evident. And we'll include a number of other participants and observers. And I think we'll also go into other domains. I'm particularly interested in the food dimension and the living systems dimensions. And so in subsequent sessions, we'll also have the country's leading space medical person from Adelaide and from Tasmania. He's co-located. And he'll talk to us and bring together a number of people who are actually designing the wherewithal to live in extreme environments, in the absence of oxygen and a number of things we're used to. And I think that all of this is really very, very, very powerful motives for us to think more about community and how we function as people in these places. now that we have the prospect of liquid water on the moon, there will probably be, if that happens, we can identify that closely, we'll have a number of habitations, settlements, research stations, how they coexist. All of this will be important for us to think about. Anyway, please join us next Tuesday, the 24th, 9 o'clock. And that will be followed that day at 11 o'clock on the question of survival in space, led by Gordon Cable from Adelaide and Tasmania. Thank you all once again. I hope we'll be in touch again soon. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. And a reminder, the recording will be available in a couple of weeks on the same registration site. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Donna. Thanks, Roy. Thanks, Chris.